Somewhere in America right now, a 28-year-old is opening an app on their phone to check a number they already know by heart. It's not their bank balance. It's not their credit score. It's the number that follows them into every job interview, every apartment application, every conversation about buying a house, having kids, or just living a normal life. That number is $43,000. And it hasn't gone down in 6 years. In fact, it's gone up. Welcome to the strangest debt trap in modern history. Not a mortgage, not a car loan, not even credit cards. This is student debt, and right now, it sits at $1.7 trillion, spread across more than 43 million Americans. That's more than the entire GDP of Canada, more than the combined market value of Apple and Microsoft. And unlike a house or a car, you can't repossess an education. You can't hand back a degree when you can't pay for it. So here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer honestly. Is this just an inconvenient burden for a generation of graduates? Or is it quietly becoming the next system-wide financial crisis? The one that creeps up on the economy the way subprime mortgages did in 2007. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand why some economists are calling this the slowest moving bubble in American history, and why it might already be too late to stop it. How a good idea turned into a trap. To understand how bad this got, you have to go back to a time when student debt barely existed. In the 1960s, a public university degree in America was almost affordable enough to pay for with a summer job. Tuition at a 4-year public college, adjusted for inflation, was a fraction of what it is today. The government wanted more Americans in college, so it built out a loan system through the Higher Education Act of 1965, designed to help working-class families afford school. The idea was simple and frankly noble. Lend money to students now, let them pay it back once they're earning a graduate's salary later. For a while, it worked exactly as intended. But 3 things happened over the next few decades that quietly turned this system into a monster. First, colleges realized that federal loans meant a guaranteed river of money flowing toward tuition, no matter how high they set the price. If a university raised tuition by 10%, the government simply loaned students more to cover it. There was no market pressure pushing prices down, because the buyer, the 18-year-old signing the loan papers, wasn't the one who had to worry about affordability today. They'd worry about it in 10 years, once they had a degree and hopefully a job to match. Second, in 2005, Congress passed a bankruptcy reform law that made student loans nearly impossible to discharge, even in bankruptcy. Car loans, credit card debt, medical bills, all of these can be wiped out under the right bankruptcy conditions. Student loans cannot, except in extraordinarily rare cases that courts almost never grant. This turned student debt into one of the most predatory financial products in the country, because the lender takes on almost none of the risk. Even if the student's life falls apart, the debt survives. Third, the federal government became the primary lender itself, effectively guaranteeing that loan volume would keep growing regardless of whether wages kept pace. And they didn't. Between 1980 and today, the average cost of a 4-year degree in the United States has risen by more than 1,200%. Wages for entry-level graduates over that same period rose by a fraction of that. The gap between what a degree costs and what a degree pays didn't just widen, it became a canyon. The machine that never stops growing. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, and where you start to see why people are calling this a bomb rather than just a burden. Unlike a mortgage, where you pay down the principal every month and eventually own the house outright, a huge percentage of student loan borrowers are on income-driven repayment plans. These plans cap your monthly payment based on how much you earn, which sounds compassionate, and in some ways it is. But there's a catch that almost nobody explains clearly when you sign up. If your capped payment is lower than the interest accruing on your loan every month, your balance doesn't shrink. It grows. You can make every single payment on time for years and watch your total debt increase anyway. This isn't a rare glitch in the system. Government data has shown that a significant share of borrowers on these income-driven plans see their balances rise, not fall, in the years after graduation. Imagine paying your mortgage faithfully for a decade and discovering you owe more than the day you signed the papers. That's the daily reality for millions of graduates in America right now, and it's precisely why so many describe their debt not as something they're paying off, but as something they're simply managing to survive under. Add to this the interest rates themselves. Federal student loans aren't cheap money. Depending on when you borrowed and what kind of loan you took, rates have often sat well above what homeowners pay on a 30-year mortgage. Private loans, taken out to cover the gap federal aid doesn't reach, can be even steeper, sometimes with variable rates that climb whenever the broader economy tightens. Put these pieces together: rising tuition, stagnant wages, a repayment structure that can grow your debt even while you pay it, and a legal system that won't let you escape it through bankruptcy. And you get something economists rarely see: a form of debt that behaves less like a loan and more like a life sentence with monthly check-ins. The generation living inside the debt numbers on a page are one thing. What this actually does to a generation's life is another. Take home ownership. For decades, buying a first home in your late 20s was the default milestone of American adulthood. Today, the average age of a first-time homebuyer in the United States has climbed into the late 30s. And one of the most cited reasons, across countless surveys of millennials and younger workers, is student debt preventing them from saving a down payment or qualifying for a mortgage in the first place. When a lender calculates your debt-to-income ratio, a 5-figure student loan balance can be the difference between approval and rejection, even if your monthly payment feels manageable on paper. Then there's the ripple effect on marriage and family formation. Multiple studies tracking borrowers over time have found that people carrying heavy student debt delay marriage, delay having children, or have fewer children than they said they wanted, specifically citing the financial pressure of their loans. This isn't a minor economic footnote. This is a shift in the fundamental rhythm of a country's population, and it compounds. Fewer young families forming means less demand for starter homes, fewer new households setting up bank accounts, buying furniture, insuring cars, all the small transactions that make up the beating heart of consumer spending, which itself makes up roughly 70% of the entire American economy. And here's the twist that makes this different from almost every other debt crisis in history. The people carrying this burden aren't reckless spenders who bought boats and vacations they couldn't afford. They followed the advice every parent, guidance counselor, and politician gave them for 50 straight years. Get a degree, and you'll be fine. Many of them did everything right, by the rules as they were explained, and still ended up trapped by a financial structure that was quietly rigged against them before they ever signed the paperwork. Why the universities never feel the pain if the borrowers are suffering, and the government is footing much of the risk. Who exactly benefits from a system like this? Follow the money, and you land squarely on the institutions themselves. American universities, particularly large ones, have spent the last 3 decades in what can only be described as an arms race. Not for better teaching, but for better amenities. Climbing walls, luxury dormitories, sprawling administrative departments that didn't exist a generation ago, and executive salaries for university presidents that sometimes rival those of corporate CEOs. None of this is illegal, and much of it is even popular with students choosing between competing schools. But all of it costs money, and that money comes from tuition, which comes from loans, which come from a lending system with essentially no ceiling. Because the federal government backs so much of this lending, universities face almost no consequence when tuition rises faster than inflation, faster than wages, faster than almost anything else in the American economy. There's no natural market signal telling a university, "Stop, your customers can't afford this anymore," because the customer isn't really paying in real time. They're borrowing against a future income that may or may not materialize the way they hoped. This is why, when people call the student loan system a bubble, they're using the word correctly in an economic sense, not just a political talking point. A bubble forms when the price of something detaches from the actual value it delivers, propped up by easy financing rather than genuine underlying worth. Housing did it in the 2000s. Now education pricing has done something eerily similar, just slower, and with far less dramatic headlines, because nobody is losing their home in a single dramatic foreclosure moment. Instead, it's a slow leak, one delayed wedding, one postponed home purchase, one canceled vacation at a time, spread across tens of millions of households. Is this actually like 2008? This is the comparison everyone eventually reaches for. So let's actually test it honestly, because the answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. In 2008, the crisis exploded because mortgage debt was bundled into securities, sold to investors around the world. And when homeowners started defaulting en masse, It triggered a chain reaction through banks that had bet enormous sums on those securities being safe. The danger wasn't just that people lost their houses. It was that the entire financial system was interconnected in ways nobody fully understood until it collapsed. Student debt doesn't work quite the same way, and that's actually important to be honest about. The vast majority of it, roughly 90%, is held directly by the federal government, not by private banks or complex mortgage-backed securities scattered through the global financial system. That means a wave of student loan defaults wouldn't trigger a 2008-style banking collapse in the same mechanical way, because the losses would hit the government's balance sheet, rather than cascading through interconnected private banks. And this is the part that matters, that doesn't mean it's harmless. A crisis doesn't have to look identical to 2008 to still be a crisis. If tens of millions of borrowers can't pay, can't buy homes, can't spend the way previous generations did, the damage shows up differently. Slower economic growth, a permanently smaller consumer base, a generation locked out of the wealth-building tools like home equity that built the American middle class in the first place. It's less an explosion and more a slow puncture, deflating growth over years rather than collapsing a bank over a weekend. There's also a real fiscal question buried in here. Every dollar of student debt that gets forgiven, restructured, or simply never repaid becomes a direct cost to taxpayers, because the government is the primary lender. Recent attempts at mass loan forgiveness have run into legal and political roadblocks precisely because of how enormous that price tag is. Hundreds of billions of dollars, potentially over $1 trillion, added directly to the national debt in one move. So even the proposed solutions carry their own economic shockwaves. The political football nobody can actually kick this is where student debt becomes almost uniquely American in its dysfunction. Because it's not just an economic problem, it's a political one that neither party has been able to genuinely solve. One side of the debate argues for broad forgiveness, framing it as correcting a system that was rigged against an entire generation before they were old enough to understand the fine print they were signing. The other side argues that forgiveness is deeply unfair to the millions of Americans who either didn't go to college, paid off their loans through sacrifice, or chose cheaper paths specifically to avoid this debt. And that wiping the slate clean rewards the exact borrowing behavior that inflated tuition in the first place. Both arguments contain real truth, which is exactly why this has become such a political stalemate. Forgiveness attempts have been proposed, challenged in court, scaled back, and repackaged multiple times without ever fully resolving the underlying structural problem. Tuition costs that keep rising, a lending system with no natural brakes, and a generation caught in the middle of a fight that started before most of them were born. Meanwhile, the debt keeps accumulating in the background, growing quietly by tens of billions of dollars a year, regardless of which political solution is being debated in any given election cycle. What happens if nothing changes? So let's play this forward, because this is really the question underneath everything else. If the system continues exactly as it is, tuition rising, wages lagging, income-driven plans letting balances grow instead of shrink, what does America actually look like in 10 or 20 years? Picture a country where an even larger share of adults in their 30s and 40s are still carrying education debt from their early 20s, some of it having grown rather than shrunk over that time. Picture homeownership rates continuing to slide for anyone without family wealth to fall back on, deepening a wealth gap that already splits sharply along generational and racial lines. Since data consistently shows Black borrowers, for example, carry higher average balances and take longer to repay than white borrowers with comparable degrees. Picture a labor market where young workers increasingly choose careers based not on passion or aptitude, but on which jobs pay enough to service a loan balance that keeps compounding no matter how responsibly they live. And picture a federal government whose balance sheet carries an ever-growing pile of loans that are becoming functionally unpayable for a meaningful chunk of borrowers, forcing an eventual reckoning. Either a politically explosive mass forgiveness that adds enormous sums to the national debt, or a slow-motion default crisis playing out over years as borrowers simply stop paying because the math never works in their favor to begin with. Neither outcome is catastrophic in the dramatic, overnight sense of a stock market crash, but both represent a fundamental drag on the country's economic engine, a tax on ambition, family formation, and wealth building, paid quietly by tens of millions of people for decades. How other countries avoided this, it's worth stepping back for a moment to ask an obvious question. Does it have to be this way? And the honest answer is no, because plenty of developed countries have built completely different systems. In much of Europe, public university tuition is either free or a small fraction of American costs, funded through general taxation rather than individual loans. Countries like Germany and several Nordic nations essentially treat higher education as public infrastructure, the same way roads or public hospitals are treated, a shared cost, absorbed broadly, rather than an individual debt loaded onto 18-year-olds. Even countries that do charge tuition, like the United Kingdom or Australia, structure their loan repayment more like a graduate tax. A percentage of income above a certain threshold, automatically deducted, with remaining balances forgiven entirely after a set number of years, no matter how much is still owed. America chose a different path, one that treats higher education largely as a private investment rather than a public good, financed through individual borrowing rather than collective taxation. That choice isn't inherently wrong. It reflects a broader philosophy about individual responsibility that runs through much of American economic policy. But it does mean the risk of rising costs falls almost entirely on the individual borrower, rather than being spread across society, which is exactly why the debt has been allowed to balloon as far as it has without the kind of political intervention that would have capped it in a system built differently from the start. So is it really the next crisis? Let's bring this back to the question we opened with. Is the student debt bomb America's next 2008, or is it something else entirely? The honest answer, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a dramatic headline, is that it's not a ticking time bomb in the traditional sense of a single explosive event that topples banks overnight. It's something slower and in some ways more insidious. A long, grinding drag on an entire generation's ability to build wealth, form families, and participate fully in the economy, the way their parents and grandparents did. It's a crisis measured not in stock market points on a single Monday morning, but in delayed weddings, postponed home purchases, and a widening gap between those who inherited financial cushioning and those who didn't. Whether or not it ever produces a single dramatic collapse, the damage it's already done, and continues to do every single month to every one of those 43 million borrowers, is very real. And that, more than any single statistic, might be the most important truth buried inside America's $1.7 trillion student debt bomb. Sometimes the biggest financial crises aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones that just keep quietly ticking, year after year, until an entire generation looks up and realizes how much time they've